It's a great honor for me to inaugurate this conference on truth, and I would like to thank Unity Women's College and Kerala State Higher Education Council for making my visit possible. It's a special honor to deliver the keynote address here, since I'm not a philosopher and have only an amateur's expertise in the philosophical debates about truth that have occupied the Western philosophical tradition ever since the ancient Greeks. This, of course, makes my task the more daunting, but it seems to me important to rise to this challenge, since my principal claim is that truth concerns us all, more so than ever today, with the rise of would-be authoritarian rulers who attempt to create their own truth. That truth is definitely not a problem of philosophy alone, and above all, that if there is a solution, it is not to be found in narrowly technical philosophical arguments that leave aside the many ways in which truth functions in our daily lives. So I say this in full awareness that in the academic humanities today, at least in the West, people are often uncomfortable claiming that what they are saying is true. This is first of all because we've learned that truth claims are dependent on historical contexts and particular perspectives, and that often structures of hegemonic power prevent people from recognizing the contingency of their own situations, their own perspectives, their own methods. Yet, even if we hesitate to say that what we are asserting is sort of the truth, as teachers and scholars, and as ordinary human beings as well, we are always saying or writing things that we think are true. And in our daily lives, we not only constantly say things we believe are true, but we act on what we deem to be true. And so long as we remain open to other perspectives and other assumptions, we're willing to engage in processes of investigation and verification, we must not allow our modesty about the scope of our understanding to lead us to abandon the idea of truth, especially since, as Babu has mentioned, there are many others out there willing to step in and claim and produce their own false truths. But let me first review what I take to be the implications of Western philosophical debates about truth before turning to mentioning at least ordinary ways in which truth functions in our lives, and then finally to some examples from the field in which I have some expertise, that of recent critical theory. I mean, the treatment of truth in contemporary critical theory is complex and diverse, but I think it's not without lessons for us in the present political conjuncture, especially in the United States, but I gather in India also, where the debates about truth have taken on a new concrete and dangerous cast. Okay. Well, so philosophers are skilled at discovering and articulating difficulties with various accounts of truth, but they've not succeeded in producing a satisfactory account. The philosopher, the first slide there, philosopher Paul Horwith begins his book, a book entitled simply Truth. It will be widely agreed that hardly any progress has been made towards achieving the insight we seem to need. The common sense notion that truth is a kind of a correspondence with the facts, this one, has never been worked out to anyone's satisfaction. Even its advocates would concede that it remains little more than a vague guiding intuition. I think it's more than just a vague intuition, but it is an intuition. The traditional alternatives, equation of truth with membership in a coherent system of beliefs. It's the coherence theory of truth, or what would be verified in ideal conditions, or suitability as a basis of action, a sort of pragmatic theory of truth, have always looked unlikely to work precisely because they don't accommodate the correspondence intuition. hence the peculiarly enigmatic character of truth. The conception of its underlying nature, he concludes, appears to be at once necessary and impossible. Well, so the most commonsensical theory of truth is this correspondence theory, which claims that a belief or a proposition expressed by an utterance is true if it corresponds to a state of affairs. So, I am in Kerala now was not true when I wrote it some days ago, but now that I say it, I have no hesitation in calling it true. I mean, this is common sense realism, right? The world is relatively independent of our dealings with it, so to decide whether it's true that there is food in the refrigerator, I would open the door and look in. But can that be expanded to a general theory of truth? That seems doubtful. As soon as we go beyond simple assertions about easily determinable states of affairs, their problems arise. So, for example, assertion, if we wonder about the truth of some propositions about quarks, Q-U-A-R-K-S, elementary particles that are said never to exist freely in nature, there are two difficulties here. The first is that there are no simple, independently ascertainable facts about quarks, because quarks seem to exist only as a function of the theories of particle physics and experimental techniques. They're not facts out there that we could independently compare to our propositions. And the second difficulty is that to determine whether something a physicist says about quarks is true or just an apparent effect of some procedure, we would need to have an independent vantage point, say, sort of on a God's eye view of the world, which would enable us to compare our vantage point, our particular propositions about the state of the world with the world itself. We can't step outside our own skins or our own minds to judge whether modern particle physics finally has got everything right. Now, philosophers disagree about which of these conditions is the more serious difficulty. New slide. Donald Davidson claims, for instance, that the problem is really that there is nothing for true sentences to correspond to. The correct objection to correspondence theories, he says, is not that they make truth something to which we cannot aspire, but that the real object is that such theories fail to provide the entities to which truth vehicles may be said to correspond. So one of the analytical philosophers' favorite examples, for some reason, of a proposition is the cat is on the mat. But the facts don't in general exist independently of our conceptual frameworks and not simply given. And this is true of the mats on which cats sit, as well as of quarks. So to say this is not to deny that there exists a world out there with creatures sitting quite independently of us, only that the specification of a state of affairs to which a proposition is said to correspond is a matter of conceptual frameworks, descriptive categories, perceptual and experimental procedures. So if correspondence theories are problematic, philosophically and inadequate, others have proposed pragmatic theories of truth. The truth is what works. The attraction of this is it seems to deal with the objection that to a conventionalist account of truth, that it needs to account for the fact that, in general, modern science works. We understand how to treat some diseases. Miraculously, information can be sent through the ether over what is called the internet, which certainly suggests that at least some people have understood some rather recondite facts about energy, electronics, information, etc. Airplanes fly, which suggests that modern science's understanding of fluid dynamics must be largely correct. And if it weren't correct, then the planes would not be able to take off or stay up. But the trouble with pragmatic theories, critics object, is that it gets the relation backwards, that something is not true because it works, rather it works because it's true. And that seems like a very sensible objection, but one can further imagine situations where scientists and engineers just got lucky, shall we say. They didn't actually understand the underlying processes or mechanisms, but something they designed nonetheless happens to work for quite different reasons. It's certainly possible to imagine that, for example, modern medicine can prescribe remedies which work for reasons that we don't really understand. And of course, it's easy to imagine cases where the understanding of physical laws and properties might be true, but where the experiments or the devices we design would not work. This happens all the time in school and college science labs, for example. The failure of students to get the right results in their chemistry experiments is not taken to put in question the truths of basic chemistry, or to show that the underlying science is wrong. We just say, oh, the student must have been clumsy or something of that sort. So there we have cases where the equation of truth with what works is certainly too hasty and too crude to serve as an adequate theory of truth. And the final traditional notion is the coherence theory of truth, which starts from the wholly defensible notion that, in general, the truth of propositions depends upon conceptual frameworks and their interrelation with other propositions. The truth that water boils at 100 degrees centigrade depends on agreement about a scale of temperature, how it's to be measured, at sea level, for example, and what counts as boiling. Or Russia has an authoritarian regime is a statement that depends on other propositions about what counts as authoritarian, what qualified observers can agree about governmental procedures in that country, etc. So usually the way you test the truth of a belief or proposition is by seeing how it relates to other beliefs or propositions that have already withstood critical examination. It coheres with a system. Once again, there seem two objections to this account of truth. The first is that propositions which do not cohere with any set of beliefs or propositions, but which must be, according to objectors, either true or false, or sort of left out. So, for example, we could probably say that, the proposition that Napoleon dropped his razor while shaving the morning of the Battle of Waterloo. This must be either true or false. Either he dropped his razor or he didn't drop his razor, right? But there's no set of propositions, I take it no relevant verified propositions that relate to this issue. What coherence theorists would reply is that begs the question. In their account, propositions that do not cohere with other propositions are simply not true. The second objection would be perhaps the more fundamental one, that propositions that once cohered with a whole set of other propositions have later been deemed not to be true, that Newtonian physics has allegedly been superseded by quantum mechanics, etc. So that a coherence theory of truth must extend beyond beliefs that people actually have at a particular moment to some larger set of beliefs. Anyway, well, these considerations about various theories of truth in the philosophical analytic tradition especially yield a rather puzzling result, that analytical philosophers are very good at identifying problems with any given theory of truth, yet they're inclined quite enthusiastically to defend the notion of truth against something of a straw man, some sort of relativism they associate either with general skepticism about knowledge or with a postmodern constructivism alleged to deny the existence of truth and to claim that there are only opinions derived from ideology and historical situations. There are few thinkers who will actually say anything like that. The American philosopher Richard Rorty is notorious for saying that truth is what your colleagues will let you get away with. It's a sort of a pragmatic and coherent notion of truth, which when people say, oh no, that's horrible, that's a horrible idea. But Rorty is a defender, in fact, he's a defender of the collaborative institutional frameworks and especially of modern science as a model for cooperative discussion. So he's not really the skeptic that he's alleged to be. He just thinks that truth talk is misleading, that it implies an adequate theory that we don't really have. But I think a better approach to the problem might be to think about how the notion of truth actually functions, both in ordinary life, which would be my first example, and then in the discourses of people who question traditional notions of truth. If I were to say, for example, we are running late today, we are running late this morning, you would all say, very true, right? And it's not, I think to say that is not to make some fundamental, deep epistemological or ontological claim, but simply to signal general approbation or agreement with something somebody has said. It suggests that truth is not always something so momentous that we ought to be wary of claiming that something is true. The British philosopher J.L. Austin, there's another new slide here with Austin, observes in his groundbreaking work, How to Do Things with Words, that it's important to realize that true and false, like free and unfree, do not stand for anything simple at all, but only for the general dimension of being the right and proper thing to say, as opposed to the wrong thing in these circumstances to this audience for these purposes and with these intentions. So he cites some propositions like, the galaxy is the shape of a fried egg. He says, is this true or not? Well, that's probably the wrong question, right? That statements, there are various degrees and dimensions of success, and statements fit the facts more or less loosely on different occasions for different purposes. It may be vague or exaggerated, etc. So we could say that for some purposes, indicating what the vague shape, it's all okay, this is perhaps an appropriate thing to say, but for others, astronomers are not going to say that's true, the universe is the shape of a fried egg, to an exact. In fact, philosophers frustrated at the difficulty of producing an adequate theory of truth have developed what they call a minimalist or deflationary account of truth, insisting that the term true does not add anything to an assertion. So if I assert that the cat is on the mat, that strange example, I don't add anything to it, they would say, by saying it is true that the cat is on the mat. Right? The expression "it is true" is just a convenient way of granting or approving things that are said. But I can do that just by saying that the cat is on the mat is already an assertion of a state of affairs. So these philosophers may be right that we don't need a philosophical theory of truth, but I can't accept this minimalization of the notion of truth, which plays an important role in our lives. So there's a rather different use of truth as sort of aspirational or as indicating the goal of inquiries. Here we have another slide. There's a W.H. Auden, the 20th century British poet, wrote an amusing poem entitled "Oh, Tell Me the Truth About Love," which begins, "Some say love's a little boy, and some say it's a bird, some say it makes the world go round, and some say that's absurd." And then the poem concludes, "When it comes, will it come without warning, just as I'm picking my nose? Will it knock on my door in the morning, or tread on in the bus on my toes? Will it come at the change in the weather? Will its greeting be courteous or rough? Will it alter my life altogether? Oh, tell me the truth about love." So there are often things like love about which we would like to know the truth, even though we generally know that there's no way we could actually come to know the truth, what is the truth about love. I mean, truth in this sense is a goal that we assume will never be reached. And that's certainly a notion of truth that's at work in literary criticism. A new slide. Paul de Man writes that understanding is an epistemological event. This does not mean that there can be a true reading of a text, but that no reading is conceivable in which the question of its truth or falsehood is not primarily involved. And I think that's important, that interpretations are attempting to be true, to say something true about the text. Humanists who may hesitate to call what they say the truth nevertheless proceed by proposing what they take to be true rather than false. And of course, very frequently, the most common procedure in literary criticism perhaps is to begin by challenging previous interpretations of a text which you take to be inadequate in one way or another, incomplete or wrong in various ways. So certainly we don't in general believe that there is a one true reading of a text, one true interpretation, but that doesn't eliminate the notion of truth. The truth of the text is something we aim at, something that gets elaborated in discussion with others, but not something we believe exists sort of independently of our reading, something there to be reached once and for all. And that seems to me a complicated but very significant aspect of our notion of truth. So one of the more paradoxical aspects of truth is that there are innumerable truths that we depend on every day just to get through life, but where the term truth usually doesn't arise because it doesn't occur to us to doubt them. So for instance, if I'm going home from the university, there's no doubt whatsoever for me that I live on Wyckoff Road in Ithaca, New York. This is a shall we say, a fundamental truth. Well, I don't think about it in that way. It's a truth to which the term would only be applied if someone else were misinformed and doubted me and said, do you really live on Wyckoff Road? And I would say, yes, it's true. We depend on the accuracy of maps to get us where we're going, the truth of directions about how to make our various devices work. But in such cases, we don't often speak of true. We don't say, oh yes, this account of what to do with my phone is true, right? Unless we discover to our annoyance that a map is out of date or inaccurate. So we don't often invoke truth except in argument, but truth is nonetheless indispensable. We depend, as I've said, on engineers, manufacturers to have grasped the truth about how things are going to work. There are also innumerable truths that never even come to consciousness, but that nevertheless structure our world. For example, I'm firmly convinced that none of you in the audience are 10 feet tall. I take this to be truth. It's related to other propositions about the world and about human beings. But again, it's only if the question of truth or falsity of things like this is proposed that we would be likely to speak of the truth of that belief or that proposition. But that doesn't make truth any less important. It just indicates how much we generally rely on truths that are never questioned. So I think we might say that some of our hesitation, at least in the West, in the humanities, about calling what we say true comes from considering the notion of truth in something of a vacuum, out of contact with our daily lives, as if it were sort of truth with a capital T, a universal truth, eternal truth, whereas we operate all the time with a lowercase notion of truth as what we take to be true as opposed to false, like the fact that I live on Wyckoff Road, which is true rather than false. But if you invited me here to speak about truth, it's not because you wanted my amateur's opinion about philosophical debates, but because I've written about contemporary critical theory where there have occurred critical developments that have made humanists uneasy about making claims to truth. So I'm going to speak about two examples here. I will say something first about the case of Jacques Derrida, a deconstructionist philosopher, but I should note that there are disagreements among Derrida experts about his dealings with truth, which would require rather extensive and technical arguments to try to sort out, and I'm not sure that his case is of much help to us here, but it is worth, since this is one of my domains of expertise, to say something about truth in Derrida. I will stress 3 points. First, there is in Derrida's writing, you will have a slide. Okay, yes, in Derrida's writing, from the early works such as Grammatology and Plato's Pharmacy in Dissemination, there is a critique of what he presents as the notion of truth dominant in the Western philosophical tradition. So Derrida writes, all the metaphysical determinations of truth are more or less inseparable from the instance of the logos, or of a reason thought within the lineage of the logos. So the logos, from which comes the Greek root that represents knowledge, and all those words in ology, like biology, philology, psychology, geology, the logos is the source of those ologies, as it were. In theological discourse, the logos is the word of God, divine truth. In more secular terms, it's a truth that we seek to know, a rational principle that governs the universe. So in these works of Derrida, it's through an analysis of the notion of writing, which is classically conceived as just a means of expression, which ought to be as transparent as possible to permit direct access to logic, reason, truth, etc., it's through his analysis of writing that Derrida unsettles the hierarchy that makes writing a mere external accessory to speech, thought, and truth. So another slide, I guess we have it there. An expanded radicalized notion of writing inaugurates, he declares, the desedimentation, the deconstruction of all the significations that have their source in that of the logos, particularly the signification of truth. But Derrida shows that in Plato or Husserl or elsewhere, it is writing as an iterability of writing that creates the possibility of meaning and truth, and the very possibility of traditionally opposing speech to writing on the basis of presence versus absence, or immediacy versus representation, is an illusion, since speech itself is already structurally dependent on difference, much as writing, and thus can be seen, he argues, as a species of a generalized writing as a system of difference. So the notion of an expanded writing is a dramatic way of putting the case that truth claims always depend upon a structure or a system of representation. That's the first point. Second point is related to this. Philosophy, Derrida argues, has been a metaphysics of presence. I think we have that already up there, in which representation is treated as secondary or inessential. He writes, it could be shown that all names related to fundamentals, to principles, or to the center have always designated the constant of a presence. So philosophical attempts to, which speak about meaning as what someone has in mind, as if it were there present in your mind at the moment you speak. So philosophical attempts to describe what is fundamental or a ground involve oppositions in which one term belongs to the logos and a higher presence, and the other marks a falling away, a complication, a negation, or a manifestation of the first. So here we have a new slide. Yes. Is that right? Yes. So here's some basic oppositions in the Western tradition: meaning versus form, soul versus body. You see the second is sort of the manifestation or a complication of the first. Nature, culture, intelligible, sensible, transcendental, empirical. So then analysis becomes a matter of, for the philosophical tradition, of returning strategically in idealization to an origin or a priority seen as simple, intact, normal, pure, standard, in order then to conceive of derivation, complication, deterioration, accident. Derrida writes, all metaphysicians have proceeded thus, from Plato to Rousseau, from Descartes to Husserl. This is not just one metaphysical gesture among others, it is the metaphysical exigency. Well, the critique of presence, or logocentrism, or the metaphysics of presence, undoes truth as phenomenal presence. As truth is never given as such immediately. That's always part of a system of representation. And yet, and here we come to the third and crucial point, Derrida's analyses, his readings of philosophical texts, always make truth claims about what is happening in these texts. They're carried out, these readings are carried out in terms of a bivalent logic of truth versus falsity, pursued to the point often where logic confronts a blockage of some kind or a contradiction. His arguments are always making truth claims, even if the words truth do not appear. As Christopher Norris, one important commentator, writes, here's another slide, Derrida's point is not at all the obsolescence of truth talk or the need to replace it with a Nietzsche-inspired genealogy of power knowledge. Rather, it's the failure of logocentric thinkers from Plato on down to make good on their express or implicit claims for a pure, unimpeded access to truth through a range of candidate items like concepts, ideas, intuition, sense data, and so forth that might be relied on to grant such access by reason of a transparent rapport à soi or intrinsic self-evidence. Derrida's readings involve a commitment to the pursuit of truth in analysis that's in no way vitiated by the fact that rigorous analysis frequently highlights a logical impasse. In a little book called Limited Ink, responding to the claims that deconstructionists do not believe in meaning or truth, he replies, and here we have a paper, yes, that the answer is simple enough. This definition of the deconstructionist is false. That's right. False, not true, and feeble. It supposes a bad, that's right, bad, not good reading of numerous texts, first of all mine, etc. Then perhaps it will then be understood that the value of truth and all those values associated with it is never contested or destroyed in my writings, but only reinscribed in a more powerful, larger, more stratified context. So, in the case of truth, the expanded context include, as Derrida indicates, performative dimensions of language which make truth-telling a particular case of linguistic activity. And elsewhere he insists on his commitment to truth as emerging from the context of possible untruth. I think we can, is that in the slide? Yes, I have no, he writes that, yes, to have the possibility of an authentic, sincere, and full meaning of what one says, the possibility of failure or a lie or something else must remain open. That's the structure of language. Right? Would be no truth otherwise. I insist on this because if I didn't say this, I would be considered someone who is opposed to truth or simply doesn't believe in truth. No, I am attached to truth. But I simply recall that for truth to be true, for the meaning to be meaningful, the possibility of misunderstanding or lie must remain, must remain structurally always open. That's the condition for truth to be true. The truth is inescapable. And occasionally, particularly in polemical context, he does say explicitly that he writes, for example, that Agamben's central claims about Foucault are literally false. He says Agamben is just, what he says about Foucault is just false. But anyway, finally, whereas Norris's point is that Derrida's readings as arguments necessarily involve questions of truth and falsity, in a late conversation with Eveline Grossman, Derrida expatiates on what she called a passion for truth. Here we have another slide. The paradox that you yourself noted is that this passion, I wouldn't say that it's not a passion for truth, that I am in a certain sense passionate about truth, but it is at the same time accompanied by and probably motivated by a belief that truth infinitely withdraws itself from interpretation. And that's a concept of truth as sort of goal that I was mentioning before. Not that it doesn't exist. I never said there is no truth, but I would say that the concept of truth does not answer to what I am looking for and what we are looking for in decoding. As to say, at the end of decoding, there is no access to a true and established meaning. And later he continues, this is my final Derrida quote, you have that? There is consequently a need, I would say, a drive for truth that fuels all my work of interpretation, that is compatible with a certain mistrust, a certain suspicion of what is generally called truth as final meaning. There is a drive for truth, but I dare not present it in that way. It would lead to too many misunderstandings. I would add, as an aside, he says, that when I try to think, to work, to write, and when I believe that something true must be put forward to the public sphere, to the public scene, then there is no force in the world that can stop me. One can call it a passion, as you say, a passion for truth. Well, I think Derrida's is an extremely interesting case, but as you can tell, rather complicated and sort of difficult to sort out. I think a major lesson is that this deconstruction of metaphysics does not lead to a jettisoning of truth, but we're left with a broader sense of truth, which includes notions of accuracy and demonstration, yet is also aspirational, aware of the contingency of any stabilization, and suspicious of claims to have reached or to present a final truth. A case, and it's concerned. It's also a case in which he is concerned not with the kind of ordinary everyday truths that I've been stressing. He's talking about truth above all in reading and interpretation. A case that I think is more useful for our purposes in thinking about truth today is that of Bruno Latour. We have a slide there with Bruno, who is a French, not as well known as Derrida, but a sociologist, historian, and philosopher of science, who studies the ways in which scientific truth, the scientific practices in a range of fields actually produce their results and generate truth. So he has been concerned to demystify certain myths about science, that the scientific experiments will suddenly reveal truth. It's a much more complicated process or procedure. How is truth produced? Through processes of interaction, revision, and so on. And his work has led to the development of what is called actor network theory, which I'll say more about in a moment, which attempts not to overcome the opposition between subject and object or mind and nature that underlies most approaches to the problem of truth, but rather to sort of set it aside, leaving it untouched, and in brief, adopting a different picture of the world as a network of human and non-human agents interacting with each other. Traditional accounts of truth set the subject over against the reality, right, or mind over against the object, and then the problem is how to claim, for the realist, is how to claim that the mental representations actually capture reality. Whereas the anti-realist argues that it's the categories or conceptual frameworks of the mind that make reality what it is. Latour is sometimes accused of being a constructivist, since he's interested in how scientific truth is constructed. He says that no one could believe in the constructivist account for more than 3 minutes, as it were, that the mind somehow really creates the reality. Within this framework for science, there's always the question, of course, within the traditional framework, did the scientist really discover something that was already there, or did the scientist bring into being something that it then describes? And Latour writes, we have a quotation, most philosophy of science, since humankind consists of taking on, evading, hedging, coming back to, recanting, solving, refuting, etc., this impossible antinomy, that on the one hand facts are experimentally made up and never escape from their man-made settings. On the other, it's essential that facts are not made up and that something emerges as not man-made. So both the realist and anti-realist are trying to bridge this gap. But if we recognize that humans are not minds in a vat, shall we say, but are actors in a world that is also acting, that is responding to or resisting the investigative procedures, then the properties of the world in the interaction with actors in networks take on a different character. So Latour writes, another slide. Yes, the idea of an isolated mind in the vat looking at the outside world from which it's cut off is so implausible it cannot hold up much longer, especially since psychologists themselves have already redistributed cognition beyond recognition. There's no world outside, not because there's no world at all, but because there's no mind inside, no prisoner of language with nothing to rely on but the narrow pathways of logic. Speaking truthfully about the world is a very common practice for the richly vascularized societies of bodies, instruments, scientists, and intuitions. We speak truthfully because the world is articulated and not the other way around. So how is truth produced? Latour is interested in the elaborate processes, the endless experiments, the struggles, the debates, the explorations of interconnections with other results and established knowledge that end up with some result that is stable enough to be accepted, that requires the character of truth. It's eminently social, tested, verified, and in part the result of actions of non-human agents. That's crucial. So once you study in detail how scientists work, you come to appreciate this elaborate network formed by the interaction of scientists, instrumentation, physical and biological materials they're experimenting with, and the scrutiny of others who interact with the results of these experiments. So next slide. In the most salient feature of so-called actor network theory is its insistence that anything that modifies a state of affairs by making a difference counts as an actor. So, for instance, given the set of conditions, a set of conventions and purposes for which a map is being made, the landscape becomes an agent, an actor, and dictates how it is to be mapped. Right? Latour offers a simple but instructive example concerning agency from the realm of public debate about gun control in the United States. The National Rifle Association, resisting any gun control measures, insists that their slogan is "Guns don't kill, people do." Right? It's not the only agents, they say, are the people, so the gun is just an inert metal device. So any control measures should be directed at people, not at guns. Whereas the partisans of gun control insist, on the contrary, that guns kill people. The gun is the crucial actor in these scenarios. If there's no gun, there would be no mass shootings, right? This dichotomy mirrors the way we think about subjects and objects, right? But obviously a gun without a shooter is just an inert device. So and similarly a person without a gun is not a shooter. A person makes the object a lethal weapon, and the gun activates the person as shooter. The reality is that this combination of person plus gun that results in the shooting, and complex networks where there are also many other factors, including the discourses that stigmatize certain populations and create situations in which shooting them becomes more likely. But the gun is a crucial actor in this network. Latour writes, mistake. We acknowledge, never mind, it's not a quotation there. The only realistic way, we frequently, many of our ways of speaking acknowledge this role of non-human actors when we talk about the soap removes dirt, or the kettle boils, or the hammer hits the nail, or something of that sort. In the scientific cases Latour has pursued in such diverse areas as neuroendocrinology, or soil science in the Amazon, or the French atomic science prior to World War II, or the case I'm going to talk about here is Louis Pasteur's discovery of microbes. These are more elaborate than the shooter with a gun or a carpenter with a hammer. We'll take the next slide. Yes, it involves science in the making, this messy process of attempting experiments and interpreting the action that follows in elaborate collaborative processes that may eventually yield results that secure wide acceptance and become scientific truth. They are of special interest, as I say, because they have produced truth. In the case of Pasteur, here Latour traces the processes by which Pasteur moves from a purely chemical explanation of lactic fermentation to explanation in terms of the action of a living organism, a yeast that causes the fermentation. This yeast is scarcely detectable under a microscope. Nothing indicates that it's a separate material. Yet he comes to conclude that this yeast plays a principal role in lactic fermentation. This conclusion results from elaborate interactions between the scientists and this mysterious, practically undetectable substance, which others see as some minor and accidental contaminant, just something that got into the mix that shouldn't be there. Pasteur subjects these spots of gray substance to numerous operations or trials, adjusting proportions of chalk and sugar, adjusting temperature, and ultimately, Latour writes, designating an actor. I'll have another next slide. Something that can be said to produce effects in various circumstances. He writes, most of an experimenter's ingenuity goes into designing devious plots and careful staging that make an actant, the actor here, participate in new and unexpected situations that will actively define it. It's a cooperation and interaction between experimenter and this object. And the new truth will depend on the success of this agent in convincing others of its reality. In his reports of the experiments, Pasteur has to display to other scientists that the action of the ferment occurs independently of his own imagination, indeed something they can reproduce in their labs as well. The independence of the yeast as actor, in turn, makes Pasteur a successful scientist, as the person who has shown to the satisfaction of his peers that the fermentation is the result of a living organism and not a purely chemical decomposition. So it's crucial to the operation that no matter how artificial the setting, something new and independent of the setting can be seen to emerge. So what's striking here is not the opposition between the action, is that there's not an opposition between the action of the scientist and that of the substance, that they go together. As Latour notes, here we go, Pasteur does not try to pretend that his work played no part in creating this entity. He's very proud of being the first in history to create the conditions to make lactic acid ferment free to appear at last as a specific entity. Now, while in some quarters science studies are said to have debunked science, held to have debunked science, showing that alleged scientific truth is officially constructed, Latour notes that, as I say, the correspondence truth is so unsatisfactory that no philosopher would seriously defend it on the one hand, but no one can be convinced by a purely social constructionist account for more than 3 minutes. It's not that our imagination creates the reality. When Latour was asked in an interview, here we have another slide, what themes do you look on as most important when you look back on the many topics that you've written about? He replied, I think I've never had any other interest in the exploration of the many ways there are to find the truth of a situation. So in that sense, my thought project is fully rationalist. What makes it different is that I've been interested in the diversity of those forms of reason. That's why I've been led to the study of science, of technology, of law, of religion, of fiction, etc., to find in each situation how the difference between truth and falsity, how the differences are being carried out. So I stress that for this thinker, who's frequently associated with postmodern theory, as it were, his point is to see how people actually work through their different frameworks, through their different assumptions, to modify, challenge, and end up producing something that works as truth. In many cases, the difference between truth and falsity is the result of complex negotiations in the elaborate networks that connect humans and non-human actors with institutions, procedures, and past knowledge, sometimes challenging part of past knowledge, sometimes building on it. And ultimately, the point, I think, is that truth is complex and multidimensional. In the cases I've been discussing, we're not dealing with a simple correspondence between some proposition and reality. Rather, we seem involved with something that looks at first blush more like a coherence theory of truth, the various constructions of Pasteur's experiments and behavior that reveal the ferment become integrated with other scientific observations. But as Latour stresses, it's not just coherence, for the assent of others depends on their conviction that the appearance of the agent is an independent event. And the processes by which scientists determine truth are complex, recursive, and involve considerations not just of coherence, but referentiality and of pragmatic action. No single account of truth will capture adequately what they actually do. In fact, I think here there's an analogy with the notion of meaning, between meaning and truth. Truth is like meaning. I mean, sometimes we say the meaning of the utterance is what someone has in mind. And in many cases, if we're curious, what we need to do is check our understanding against what the speaker says he or she had in mind. That's often in daily interaction. That's the concept of meaning we're functioning with. At other times, especially when dealing with a literary text, we say the meaning is determined by the language itself, that the author might have intended to mean X, but actually he wrote Y, and which by the conventions of English language means something else. Sometimes also we say context determines meaning, that to know what this, especially in literary studies, to know what this particular paragraph means, you need to look at the context, both the immediate context of the work, but also a larger social context. And sometimes people even say that the meaning of the text is the experience of the reader, what it means to the reader. To have intention, text, context, and reader. Meaning is an inescapable notion, I think, not because it's not something simple or simply determined, not determined in one simple way, but meaning is both what we understand and what we try to understand. Right? It's both practical and immediate and aspirational. And I believe that truth is much the same, that a fundamental notion but not simply determined, hence, which is why philosophers have not been able to produce an adequate single account of truth, that it functions differently in different contexts. Sometimes, in many everyday matters, correspondence with the reality seems to work, if we're not too concerned with philosophical adequacy. Sometimes it's coherence that seems essential, and at other times pragmatic criteria are at work, and often all three. In many cases, we have no difficulty at all determining truths, and in the context of our lives, we depend upon many truths. So the correspondence of the commonsensical view of truth as correspondence with reality is not, as I've indicated, satisfactory from a philosophical point of view, but in appropriately specified contexts, which are common domains of experience, it is highly functional. So, for example, given our number system and accepted ways of counting, it is false and not true, for instance, that the crowd at Donald Trump's presidential inauguration was larger than Obama's. That's false, not true. And there's no difficulty about determining that, even though Trump keeps repeating that he had the largest crowd in history. Philosophical doubts about truth do not create an alternative fact here. This is a relatively simple and circumscribed problem. So to come back in conclusion to humanists' feeling of embarrassment about claiming something is true, I believe we need to overcome this. We need to recognize that our practices, like those of Derrida and Latour, constantly involve implicit truth claims about matters we're discussing, and that it's our practice and that of scientists, rather than the philosophical conundrums, that ought to guide us. The fact that we can come to be convinced that something we believed was true is in fact false is indication that we operate in a domain of distinctions, with criteria, with frameworks, etc., and understand about the public status of testing for truth. And I think it's especially important for politics today that we not hesitate to adjudicate truth claims and not allow our modesty and our embarrassment before truth with a capital T to forestall our engagement with more pragmatic and day-to-day truths. More important for politics today that we cultivate what Derrida called a passion for truth. Important to recognize that to make truth claims is not to deny human fallibility. And infallibility, the possibility that I have a belief that is not true, does not mean that for any belief of mine it might be false. For example, the belief that I live on Wyckoff Road is certainly true. Taking oneself to be fallible is entirely consonant with recognizing that there's no possibility that a particular belief is false or a particular proposition of false is false. The whole idea of fallibility, in fact, that something we took to be true might turn out to be wrong, indicates our involvement with distinguishing truth from falsity and a certain commitment to truth. So if in this skeptical day and age we cannot be animated by a passion for truth, let us at least acknowledge that we rely on truths in our everyday lives and continually aim at truth, that it's both a foundation and an aspiration, a goal to be pursued. Thank you very much.